Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Starfest Presents Genevieve Graham this afternoon. I'm Michelle Steinhusen, the festival director, and we are privileged to be joining together to share these amazing authors and stories this rainy afternoon from the St. Albert Public Library, which sits on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. So this afternoon, this is a virtual event, but we do want it to be an interactive event. There will be an opportunity to get your questions answered at the end of the interview. So please put any questions or comments you have in the chat. If you switch your chat setting to everyone instead of host and panelists, then everyone will be able to see your questions. And as I said, we will get to everyone's questions after the interview. If you haven't had a chance to purchase Genevieve's new book, Letters Across the Sea, we will also be putting links to Audrey's books and Glass Bookshop in the comments. You'll be able to order the books from there. And of course, we have all her books at the library. So now I would like to ask Genevieve and Elinor to join me. And I will introduce you to your author and interviewer. Hello.
Hello.
So our author this afternoon, Genevieve Graham, is the USA Today and #1 best-selling author of her, not only her new novel, Letters Across the Sea, but also The Forgotten Home Child, Tides of Honor, Promises to Keep, Come From Away, and At the Mountain's Edge. She's passionate about breathing life back into Canadian history through tales of love and adventure. I did find a little piece of trivia about Genevieve. She went to university to be a professional oboe player. I'd like to hear more about that later. Genevieve lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And to interview her, we brought Elinor Florence back. Elinor joined the 2018 Starfest as a featured author. And we're excited to have her again. After a long journalism career, Elinor published her first novel, Bird's Eye View, in 2014. It became a Canadian bestseller. She released Wildwood in 2018, and it was named by Kobo one of the best Canadian novels of all time, which is pretty high praise. Elinor has written a series of stories about Canada's wartime history, many of which appeared in the collection My Favorite Veterans, True Stories from World War II's Hometown Heroes. And we also have Elinor's books in the library. So I'm going to hand things over to Jen and Elinor, and I would like to invite you once again, put your questions in the chat, and we will have a chance to ask them. So thank you very much. I'll see you in an hour.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. Well, it's so nice to meet you at last, even just virtually. Yeah. I've been a big admirer. I love your, I always feel that we're kindred spirits, in the words of the great Anne Shirley, the greatest Canadian fictional heroine of all times. Breathing life into history one story at a time, because that's something that I heartily endorse and try to do in my own writing. So because of our shared interest in wartime history, I'd like to start there. Instead of starting with your very latest book, Letters Across the Sea, I'd like to go back and talk about the first book that you published with Simon & Schuster back in 2015. Yes, Tides of Honor. And this is a part of a 2-book series, the first of a 2-book series, although you can read them standalone. But I thought it was really interesting that you chose to cover the same family in 2 world wars, because that is so Canadian. So many of our boys went over in the First War, won that war, came home, married, had children, and then 21 years later saw their own sons go back to fight in another world war. So Tides of Honor is about a young man from Nova Scotia named Danny Baker who loses his leg and brings home an English war bride. Both of them deal with some terrible post-traumatic effects while they struggle to earn a living in wartime Halifax. And if that isn't bad enough, then the Halifax Explosion occurs. That was a horrifying disaster that happened when a munition ship blew up in Halifax Harbor in 1917, killed 1,600 people, injured and maimed hundreds more, and decimated a large portion of the city. Now, Jen, I remember visiting Halifax for the first time in 1999 and asking the young desk clerk at our hotel, where was the museum about the Halifax explosion? And he had never heard either of the museum or the explosion. And I thought that was appalling, but I read in the notes attached to your book that you yourself were unaware of the disaster until 2008. This was the biggest man-made explosion in the world prior to Hiroshima. And I'm wondering, why do you think so few Canadians know about it?
I don't know the why, Elinor. All I know is that when I moved out to Nova Scotia, I grew up in Ontario and then I lived in Calgary for 18 years with my husband. And when I moved out here in 2008 to Nova Scotia, I had never heard of the Halifax explosion. I thought it was fiction. I'd seen something on CBC about it and I thought it was fiction. And I was chastised pretty heavily out here from the Nova Scotians saying, how can you not know? But anyone that I knew that was west of here that I was talking with, not anyone, but most people that I was chatting with had never heard of it before. And I don't understand how something that's this monumentous, I mean, this was worldwide history. And a few years ago was the 100th anniversary. And both my daughters at that time were in high school here in Nova Scotia, and neither were being taught about the explosion on the 100th anniversary. And the more I learned about the explosion, the more I understood how much was missing in our education, not only about this explosion, but all sorts of Canadian history. I mean, I freely admit all the time that I am not a historian, and I slept through history class in high school. I admit it. I was, I was up to speed for exams on the War of 1812, Plains of Abraham, and the fur trade, but I never heard of this. And everything I've written since then has been because I didn't know about it. I write the books to teach myself. And so that's where it all started. I wish I could tell you why we don't know about it. I suppose it's been eclipsed by other news, but I still think it's an important part of world history, not just Canadian, but world history. It needs to be taught. All of these things need to be taught.
Yes, and I think that if anyone is interested, Tides of Honor is a wonderful way to learn about history, as well as your other books, because you describe them so movingly and so eloquently. And I think that we have a lot of trust in your research and know that your facts are true and authentic. Moving on to the second book in the series, it's about the same family, the Baker family, and the second book, Come From Away. Now, that's not to be confused with the musical play about Newfoundland, which is so popular right now.
But I did have a lot of people come up and ask me if, if they could buy it because they were going to the show or they'd seen the show. And I said, right, this is not the same thing. You sing and dance while you read it, but it's not the same story.
You came up with the title first. So maybe you could explain to the rest of Canada what Come From Away actually means.
Come From Away is a term that's used out here in the Maritimes. I have only been in Nova Scotia, not the rest of the Maritime provinces, but I believe it's the same. Basically, if you're not born here, you are a come from away. And it can be pretty tough on come from aways. I've been here 10 years and I understand that I will never be a regular Nova Scotian. I'm a come from away. It's kind of, they're a very secluded, very internal kind of a population out here. They are families, they are generations of families. And no matter how close friends we are still outsiders. And so Come From Away came from a story that was based on a true story. Would you like to hear about that one? It's one of my favorite stories.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I did not intend for this to be a sequel. I didn't plan on writing any sequels. But what I wanted, I was living on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia when I wrote Tides of Honor and then Come From Away. And I wanted to learn about World War II along the shore and what was going on. And the more I read about it, the more amazed I got, as I always am when I learn these things, about the U-boats that were skulking around our shores and spying on the ship movements, the back and forth and everything that was going on. And we didn't know they were there. I know there was one that was moored for 2 weeks in the St. Lawrence. It was just spying on everything for 2 weeks and nobody knew it was even there. So I went to our local archives up the Eastern Shore, it's just a darling little place. And I sat down with the ladies there and I said, what can you tell me about the shore in World War II? And they said, well, can you be a little bit more specific? And I said, well, how about the U-boats? I'd love to know about those guys. And they looked at each other and they said, should we tell her about the dance? And someone else said, oh, she's never going to believe us if we tell her about the dance. And I said, well, now you have to tell me about the dance. And so I did hear this story and I did question many times how it could be true, but I have spoken with people who were actually, they can say, oh yes, my great aunt was there, my great uncle was there, something like that. So what happened was in 1942, a U-boat moored right along the eastern shore, about 10 minutes from where I was living, and half a dozen of the German sailors got out of their U-boat and they went to a local dance and they danced with the locals. And all of that is fact. And so for this book, what I did to fictionalize it was I stranded one of them here, therefore making him definitely a Come From Away and seeing how he will deal Nazis and Nova Scotians. It's an interesting blend.
Well, I just love that story. And when I was reading it, I thought that's a nugget. When you're doing your research and you hit gold, you're panning for gold, and then you hit something like that and it's a nugget. And in its oral history too, which is even more exciting because it's never been recorded or reported before, but it's true because people remember it. So that was a wonderful basis for this story. And
I sent the book to my agent to show it to him, and he said, I love the story. This is a great story, but it's not true. And I said, yes, it is, and I can prove it. So yeah, I love nuggets like that. It gets exciting when you find those.
Well, of course, the German submariner then comes ashore and lives in a cabin in the woods until he ventures into town. And Danny Baker from the first book, his sons have now grown up and gone overseas, but the main character is Grace, his daughter, who stays home to mind the store, literally, and that's how she meets the German guy. And I was particularly enchanted by the romance because I'm married to a German. He's Canadian now, but he was born and raised in Berlin. So the rugged good looks and the charming accent, were very relatable for me. And coincidentally, my husband's father flew with the Luftwaffe in World War II, and my father was with the Royal Canadian Air Force. So we're coming at it from both sides. One of the appealing things about all your novels is that there's always a romance. They're not labeled as genre romances, of course, but how important is it for the reader to have a romantic element in your historical fiction?
Well, I think it goes back, and you know this really well, Elinor, is that the whole purpose of historical fiction is to connect people to the history, to make sure that there is an emotional connection to it. History can seem like something that's black and white, which is how I see it when I first start researching it. It feels like a black and white photo. It's far away, it's inaccessible, it's kind of cold. And in order to bring it alive, you have to incorporate the characters. But you can't just incorporate characters, you have to put in people that you really care about and that the readers are really going to care about. And I have a terrible metaphor of if you see a car crash, you are going to remember it for a day or two. But if you know someone in that car crash, you are never going to forget it. And so I put my characters into that, idea, and it hopefully to make it hard to forget. And there's no more universal emotion than love. And while I don't write gratuitous, I don't write sex. I figure if my characters want to, they can go behind closed doors and do it when I'm not around. It's like I don't use swear words, I don't get gratuitous in the violence either. I just tell what's really happened. But I think that a love story is what binds it together. It's you care about the people, you care enough that you really want it to work. And if it's going to work, it has to work around the history. So it's all intertwined. And so far, every one of my books has been tied together by a love story. And I don't see that changing. I do have some ideas in mind that may expand that, but I do love having these love stories to tie them all together. It's hard to forget one of the characters when you remember the other, because they're so deeply connected. And that's the same connection as what they have with the history, if that makes any sense.
Well, you not only revealed that interesting part of history, but I was also very intrigued that you mentioned, almost as a secondary plot, that the hero was one of the guys who had sunk the SS Caribou. And that was the passenger ferry that sailed between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and it was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine in the middle of the night on October 14th, 1942, killing 137 innocent people. And I thought, wow, that could have been another book all by itself. I remember reading some very interesting human drama descriptions of what happened that night, including a little baby who flew out of his mother's arms and landed in the ocean and was kept afloat by his little nightgown that his grandmother had made long enough for him to be rescued. And were you ever tempted to write a book just about the sinking of the Caribou?
Yeah, it's an amazing story. There's a lot of stories that I run into along the way that I think, geez, this would be a good story, but it's hard, right? There's so many stories. And so you have to find one that is not just a great moment in history, but has the ability to be expanded into a story, a fictional story, as well as the facts. So as interesting as that is, and it's not off the table actually, because there is potential for it. There's I'll give you an example of when there's a story that won't work, but it's a great story to learn about. You've no doubt heard of the Butterbox babies out here. The Butterbox babies is about a home for unwed mothers, basically, that was happening out here. And they were eventually discovered that they were selling these babies from these girls unless they were not up to their standards, in which case they would take those babies and they would put them in little wooden boxes where the butter came in those boxes, and they would bury them. And sometimes the babies weren't there. But I thought that's a story that we should be telling too. But how do I put a fictional story in there? You know, I can't really use the female as one of the moms, and then who's the male part. So it's got to be a moment in history that's important, but also one that is expansive enough. And so I wonder, I mean, I still could do it with the Caribou, because there are a ton of stories that could lead into it and come out of it. But I don't know, I've done a lot of maritime stories right now, so I'm moving around the country.
I also found it quite moving. As I said, my husband is German, that the young German man was trained and indoctrinated into the Nazi mindset, but it never really took with him. It wore off pretty quickly. He just couldn't stomach the idea of killing people. And he was so happy to find a way to desert and start a new life. And I couldn't help wondering how many young Germans felt the same way, or even Canadians for that matter. So many wartime novels are about us and them, and your novel points out that the differences between us are actually pretty small once you take away the politics. Was that, that was your intention?
Yeah, it's really important to show the person behind it, and not just one side of the history. You know, there's so many things that you see in the media, and you see one side of it, and that's not right, because of course, being a human experience, there's infinite directions you could see it from. I wanted to say that when I started to write that story, it was right at the time when there was the beginning of the Syrian migration this way. And we were in a spot where we didn't know who these people were. We didn't know, are these bad refugees? Are they good refugees? Are they going to hurt us? Are they going to, everything was in the news at that point. That was the news. And we were up in arms between, neighbors saying, oh, let everybody in or don't let anybody in. And I thought, well, that's a perfect parallel to what was happening in this story with, with Nazis versus Canadians. We need to see them sort that out for themselves and pull it apart so they can see the different parts. So I'm glad that you saw that, because I think it was very important to show that Rudy was a person. He was indoctrinated into the Hitler Jugend, and so he was very deep into it, and his sisters were as well. But I don't think he ever could have gotten to the point where he reported anybody or reported his parents, and yet I did show in there that his sisters were tempted to be doing that. So I used them as a vehicle to show what was happening, on that side of it, and I used him to show that the human side of it, that there's no way this can't really be happening. So I'm glad you enjoyed that with Rudy. He needed a lot of filling out.
I should point out that writing historical fiction about the Second World War is kind of a double-edged sword, because there's a lot of information available, but there are also a lot of people around who still know the truth, and they can catch you up on mistakes. It's not like you're writing about ancient Egypt where nobody is alive who can, check up on you. I know when I'm writing about World War II, I'm extremely sensitive to being as factual as possible, because I know that there are people out there who remember.
Yes.
Did you, during the course of your research, did you actually interview any veterans?
I did not view any veterans, but I did watch interviews, and I read through the archives and everything. I did read them, but I don't know of any that were out this way. So no, I did not.
Now, your newest book, Letters Across the Sea, is also a wartime novel. And again, we're going to go back to this topic of Canadian ignorance. I think most Canadians at this point are aware of the grave misjustice done to Japanese Canadians in our country who were had their property confiscated and were sent to live in work camps during the war. But surprisingly, fewer Canadians are aware of the horrible treatment of our Canadian boys in Japanese prison camps, in which they were starved and tortured to death. And if they did come home, they came home with terrible emotional and physical wounds. And even sadder, they were captured in December 1939, right at the beginning of the war. So they were in these terrible prison camps for 5 years. And once again, I'm sounding like a broken record here, or does that term even exist? Do people know what a broken record is? Why do you think Canadians are unaware of this part of our wartime history?
I think this one has been forgotten largely in part because when the survivors did come back to Canada, there were also tens of thousands of men coming back from Europe. They were coming back and they were learning the stories of the Holocaust, and the atomic bombs had gone off. So everybody was really wound up about this. And when our men came back, though they did try very hard to get some kind of attention, they were pretty much swept under the rug. And I should point out that it was Christmas Day, 1941, actually, when the Battle of Hong Kong happened. It started on Pearl Harbor, and it extended for the next few weeks all the way up to Christmas. And that's when they were taken into these camps for 4 years. It started in Hong Kong, and then they put them into horrible, horrible places all over Japan. They worked them in mines, they worked them in shipbuilding and road building and all that, but they didn't feed them. They would feed them maybe a little bit of rice a day. I think it was like a half a cup a day, and it wasn't good rice, and these men suffered, as you said, so physically, mentally, and emotionally, that they, when they came back, they were ill with parasites. Their minds were all over the place. And it was, when they came back, they were ignored. And to know that is just very, very hard. And going on with your earlier question about the men who did survive World War II and the stories that you can still get from survivors, there are 5 remaining Canadian men from the Battle of Hong Kong who came back. An interesting side story, when I told my my future son-in-law, I told him that I was writing this story. He said, "Oh, I know all about that story. My great uncle told me about that all the time because he was there." And I said, "What? You are just telling me this now?" And he said, "Yeah, why don't you just email him? He loves to talk about this stuff. He's 97 years old." And I just, what? So I did write to him, and his name's Phil, and Phil and I were emailing back and forth. I sent him a book, but I didn't hear back. But hey, when you're 97, I don't expect much back. But it was very, he still talked about it sometimes. And the other men did too. There are documentaries about, from some of the survivors' points of view, about what happened to these men. It was a terrible, terrible injustice what happened to these men. And I mean, sometimes the mines they were digging, I've read in different reports that they believed that those were not mines, but they were graves for the men themselves, because before the Japanese were going to surrender, they wanted to blow these up and bury all the evidence between there. And also, as I wrote in that book, the Red Cross never bothered, or never was able, not that they never bothered, they were not able to get into these camps because the Japanese never ratified the Geneva Convention, so they didn't follow any rules. And so they, unlike the German or the Canadians in the German POW camps, they never got extra food. They never got any kind of books or sporting or letters from home. They were deprived of everything. And as in the book, sometimes the family was not told for months or even years that their family member was stuck in these camps. So everything that could be wrong was wrong. They witnessed starvation. They witnessed brutality. They would see their friends disciplined in the most horrible ways. They've seen them beheaded, and they've, it just is stuff that you don't even think about. And I've seen photographs of these men when they were in the camps, and they look like, I'm not comparing, but physically they looked like the people in Auschwitz. But we don't show those pictures. Those men are not seen by the general public, and they should be. Just like everything else that I'm writing, it should be known. It's just it's heartbreaking to see what happened to these men and know that they were swept under the rug. It was an interesting book, or part of the book, to write. I didn't know about it, obviously, because I never know anything about it before I start. It was for the second half of the book, and I wanted to write about World War II, but I didn't want to write about something that was already written about. I want to find something new that I have not learned before. And so I just looked up, well, I don't know anything about Pacific theater. I wonder what that's like. And lo and behold, it was the Canadians, 900 over there, completely lambs to the slaughter, and we don't know anything about that, but hopefully people know about it now.
Well, yeah, and thanks to you, one of the themes in Letters Across the Sea, just as in Tides of Honor, is the suffering experienced by veterans after they come home. And a lot of wartime fiction has a happily ever after ending. We won the war and we came home. But you emphasized in both of these novels that the trauma can last for decades, and that was something that was poorly understood at the time, except by other veterans, which probably explains the popularity of Royal Canadian Legion branches, where they congregated to share their stories and drown their sorrows in many cases. And I think that you show great sympathy for the wounded veteran.
I feel like for some, maybe all, I don't know, the war still hasn't ended, that all of these things are still inside of them. And I think we forget that too. Like there's a guy around here, and he rides along in his little scooter, and he begs. And I've seen him right down in downtown Halifax, but he's wearing his cap. He was a soldier. He was in the war, but people just walk past him. And there are thousands of those guys that we just walk past and we don't think about who they were. And I'll tell you, after I wrote that, I've never looked at those men before. The same way as I did before. And I did go into legions and I watched them in the meetings and I listened, and it is a very important part of the present that comes from the past. And I'm glad that they are getting the attention that or some of the attention that they've needed, finally.
Now, the other theme of Letters Across the Sea, because your books are complex, they're not one-note wonders, was the anti-Semitism that Canadians showed before the war, especially during the dirty 30s. I believe that was widespread right across the Western world, but of course we in Canada tend to think that we're more tolerant than other countries, so I don't think people realize that we weren't. I remember my mother talking about the German Canadian Club in Battleford, Saskatchewan, which flew the swastika right up until the war began, until they were finally forced to stop as anti-Nazi sentiment grew. But I was shocked, and this I hadn't heard of before, the Christie Pitts riot in Toronto in 1933. And I wonder if you could just describe that riot.
Of course. The Christie Pitts riot, I had seen notes about it. I had heard of it. I have been to Christie Pitts. I grew up and I saw the plaque that's there, but I never paid any attention to it. And then when I started writing all this, I realized that was the largest ethnic riot in Canadian history, and I didn't understand it at all. So what this was about, and you prefaced it great, because in 1933, during the Great Depression, everybody was scrambling for jobs and for their positions in society. But there was also, as there always is, there was very biased media, and it was feeding a lot of the poison that was coming from Germany, from Europe at that time. 1933, Hitler became the chancellor, and it's sort of the media that he generated came over to Canada, and it showed up in seeing signs in store windows that said, "Help wanted, Jews need not apply." There was a sign on the Toronto beaches that said, "No dogs or Jews," and there were Swastika Clubs. These were clubs of young men who did wear swastikas. They wore brown shirts sometimes. They went around and cleaned up the city, basically hassling or fighting with Jewish people as well, and they're hassling their businesses and everything like that. And it sort of rolled into the Jewish people had their own gangs, and it started getting angry and angry. And it was a very hot summer in 1933, and there was the one thing that families would go to, that families could always afford to go to because it was free, was baseball in Toronto. And so these families would go, there'd be thousands of people, and Christie Pitts is a very large field. There were 2 diamonds in it, and people would go by the thousands to sit there, and family, and have picnics and enjoy the games. And on this St. Peter's, which is a Protestant one, and a team called the Harvard Playground, which was mostly Jewish. And leading up to this, there had been swastika clubs that were sort of threatening that they were going to be causing trouble. Someone had painted a swastika on top of the clubhouse roof. And then on the night of the game, there's jeering going on through the game, everything like that. But it wasn't until the very end when somebody from one of the clubs stood up on the side of the field with a giant blanket with a swastika painted right in the middle of it. And that just ignited this fight. And, the players just grabbed their bats and jumped over the benches and went right in there. And the crowd was after each other. The most alarming part to me was that I say most, but a great many of these people had come armed with broken, broom handles and bricks, and they had their weapons at the ready. It turned into the spectators from other game joined into this brawl. They would drive into town, into Toronto and downtown, and go into regular Jewish delis and say, "We're getting killed out there, come on." And they would pile into trucks, thousands and thousands, over 10,000 men fighting in downtown Toronto for 6 hours. Amazingly, nobody was killed. Nobody was even really hurt. I think there were a few stitches and maybe a broken wrist, but there was really no great damage done, which is amazing considering what might happen today. But I knew nothing about that. You know, I grew up in Toronto, and I I knew that Toronto was a whole quilt of different people. That's how I always saw it. And you know, you don't look at the person that you're with in with any kind of lens that way. And to think that back then it was so cut and dry, who was good, who was bad, it was just, that was very eye-opening to me.
Once again, letters across the sea, the Battle of Hong Kong, 1941, and the Christie Pitts riots, both very interesting parts of our history that you've brought to light. Now, last year, because you're bringing out a book every year, last year, The Forgotten Home Child, I've heard so much about this novel. Yes. Concerns the number of children that were brought from Britain to Canada from 1869 to 1948, over 100,000 children. In fact, 12% of all Canadians, that's more than 1 in 10 people, I think, 1 in 8, are descended from home children. And I know 2 of them myself, Bernardo boys, as they were called, and I'd be surprised if every Canadian didn't know somebody, even if they aren't aware of it. So many of these kids were picked up off the streets of London, or they were in orphanages, correct? And they were sent over here for a better life and sent into rural Canada to be adopted. And some of them had happy and successful lives, like the 2 that I know, but many others were abused, tortured, or even killed, died of neglect. And this was a very sad book because, you know, the main characters were children. And I think that you've really made a difference to Canadian society by being instrumental in having these children recognized. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the public reaction that you've received, because I know it's been huge.
It has been. This book actually changed my life. It changed everything about how I write and why I write. The thing is, when we said at the beginning about learning history in school, when we learn about the War of 1812 and the fur trade, how is it that we were never taught about 120,000 destitute children who were sent here as indentured servants, 75% of whom, so 85,000 or so, were neglected, abused, raped, killed. They were just, and forgotten. How do we not know that story? But I didn't know it, and nobody I spoke to here knew about it. And I think that in large part, it's because the children were so badly abused and treated. If you read the book, you'll see how people look down on them, that they were garbage in everybody's eyes. They were just tools. What happened was that a lot of children never told anybody the truth about who they were. They would make up stories, they would make up families, and so their story has kind of been lost along the way, which I think a lot of them wanted that be. But the descendants do not want that to be. They want people to understand that these children were more than garbage, more than tools. These were important people, and now over 4 million Canadians are descended from them, although most have no idea. When I wrote the book, I had the support of the British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association. They are a group of, they're the group of people that are researching everything. They have a database of about 80,000 children that details everything about these children's lives. They are a huge awareness group, and they are a teaching group in that they tell people who their relatives were. And they welcomed me with open arms. They wanted me to know everything. I gave them a survey at one point that the first page asked who the home child was in their family, what they remembered about them, who they, what they liked, what they didn't like, what kind of person were they. That was the second part of the survey. And I thought I would get a few responses. And I ended up getting over 200 in 1 week. That's how enthusiastic they are to have this story known. So I actually used a lot of these stories, true stories about what happened to these children were injected into my story. So everything that you read about in The Forgotten Home Child was true. It happened to one child or another along the way. So when the book came out, they were my biggest supporters. They were selling it, or they were buying it. They were selling to their friends. I was watching them online. You have to read this, and their Facebook page was growing exponentially, and it was so exciting for me. But what really changed it for me was last November, I received an email from a reader, and she asked me if she could purchase 3 copies signed for me. And one was for her, one was for her sister, and one was for her cousin. And I said, sure. And she said, and please make it out, in honor of our great uncle, or great grandfather it was. And so I did all that, and I mailed it all out. Well, 2 weeks later, her cousin wrote back to me, and she explained that their great grandfather had been a home child. He'd been badly abused, and he never told anybody who he was. They'd been studying genealogy, and they couldn't understand how this little 6-year-old boy appears in the Halifax Pier without parents. And how does that happen? And their genealogy would just stop there because he had never told anybody. So once they realized what this was, she told me that their story for all those generations had been filled with addiction, alcoholism, infighting, a lot of strain in the family through the generations. And then when they read this, they understood it was intergenerational trauma. And she told me that reading the book was healing the family. It was bringing them together, and the family was feeling more like a family, like they understood where it came from. And he was not just somebody in the past. He was a little boy who was treated the wrong way, carried down intergenerationally. Very interesting, very parallel to the residential school system children and how it affected their descendants and themselves, obviously. I hear from descendants all the time. I get messages from them and emails from them telling me about their ancestors and how important it was that their story be out there, and also that they have learned what their ancestor went through. So yeah, it's changed the way I write. I think it's become even more personal.
Well, from your own experience that there is an avid audience for Canadian stories in Canada, especially when we're so inundated with American film and TV and books. Wouldn't it have been easier in a way to, and perhaps more clever in a marketing sense, to set your stories in the States, as so many other authors have done? And I'm curious to know, well, obviously it's your passion, Canadian history, but I'm interested to see how has that affected your sales, and how are your books received in south of the border?
Well, I write it because I want to know about it. I write for me primarily. I want to learn Canadian history because I never understood it before. I never cared for. And the more I we are what is that we talk about it? What stories that tells they are popular. Forgotten Home Child was number across.
Genevieve, I'm just going to butt in for a second. You're freezing a bit. So I'm wondering if you can refresh or yeah.
I wasn't sure if that was just me or if everyone could hear that she wasn't coming across.
Let's get her. Back.
Yeah, I'm back. Was I cutting out?
You were cutting out.
I'm sorry. We've been having a storm here, so I apologize. Yeah, Canadian history it's very important to us, but below the border, it's not obviously as popular as it is here. So my sales are limited. And so I do have to make a choice. I'm not in this to get rich. I'm more in it to share these stories. And I don't think of myself as a teacher, but the books have become teaching tools. And I'm actually hoping that they will get into high schools at some point, because that's the level that they can be read at. And you know, if they're educating Canadians, that's all I really hope for. At the same time, I am trying to write stories that will take Canadians and put them in other settings, possibly. If I send them the next book I'm writing, I've got 2 of the Canadians are in World War I, and they're over in Belgium. And so I'm taking their stories, but I'm setting them elsewhere so that hopefully people in other countries will be able to pick them up. And but other than that, no, I don't have translations of my books, and I don't have them selling all over the world. They're just here, and they're right now they belong to Canadians.
Well, thank you so much for your choice and for making that sacrifice. We listened to Anne Wheeler earlier this week at Starfest, Canadian filmmaker, and she told people that if they really want to support Canadian stories, they have to do it with their wallet. And one of the ways is to go out and buy more Canadian books. So I hope that happens for you.
Bravo to her.
Yeah. Jen, because we are connected on Facebook and Instagram, I see a lot of posts from you, and I see that you do so many events. I'm in awe of your expertise on social media, and I wondered, do you have somebody to help you with this, or do you do it all yourself?
I do it all myself.
Oh
and I think you're probably talking about the interviews that I run. Are those the ones you've seen?
Well, I
So
mean, you do stories on Instagram, you do all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, my husband wonders where I am most of the time. I think the biggest time not waster, time taker that I have created for myself, which is great and also a lot of work, is that back in March 2020, the last 2 years with The Forgotten Home and Letters Across the Sea, my books have released 1 week before lockdown. So I have stood outside chapters looking in the windows at my books that I touch, and aching to reach readers. And I thought, well, how am I going to do that? And then I realized I'm not the only one with this problem, obviously, and people want to learn about these books. So I started running interviews on my Facebook page for historical fiction authors to come, people that were coming out with releases and they would need help getting it out there. So I do interviews of these people, and I love it. I've met authors that I never would have met if I hadn't gone out on a limb and created that. Instagram's just for fun, and I usually share other things that people have sent to me. It's not as much work as the interviews, but it's all fun. It's part of my job, I guess. It's my job has grown, and especially with all of this, the online events. I joked. People were asking, so what are all your job descriptors? And being a writer, you're not just you do all these other things. And Kate Quinn that said, so what is it that you did not expect to have to learn, but you did because of this? And I said, well, I had to learn how to put on makeup properly so that I could do some Zoom calls, because I never usually did. And my daughter had to come and say, now, Mom, this is how you do it. So I've learned a lot.
Well, thanks to the magic of the internet, I'm speaking to you. I live in a little resort community called Invermere in the Rocky Mountains, but we have a cottage on Vancouver Island, and that's where I am right now, and we're expecting a big storm. So we are speaking to each other from the exact opposite sides of Canada. And I think it's just so wonderful that we're able to do that via Zoom. Now, on top of all your events and social media, you are writing a book a year. How do you find the time to research and write an entire book every 12 months?
I don't know. My husband is like, are you ever coming downstairs? I get up and I think about the books, and sometimes I don't get anything done, to be perfectly honest. Sometimes I will dive into the research and get distracted or fall asleep, and I just can't do it. But other times, once I get on a roll, I will forget where I am. I won't even look at a clock. And my husband will show up at 5:30 with a glass of wine and say, "You've missed 3 meals already, so here it's time." I think I started late with this writing. I never planned to be a writer. I, I started doing this when I was 42 years old, and I never really planned to do it in the first place. Now that I'm doing it, and all the stories keep piling up, people keep sending me story ideas, and I want to get to them all. And it's a passion. It's crazy. I'll admit that. I'm already book for 2022 is coming out in April, so that one is being but I'm already writing the book for 2023, and
Could you tell
I've
us
got an idea for
could you tell us about
the next book.
those 2 upcoming books? Yeah.
I can tell you about the one that's coming out on April 5th, 2022. It's called Bluebird, and it's already up for pre-order if you're into that. But it begins in World War I. It begins with a Canadian nursing sister. So in World War I, as you know, Elinor, that the only job that Canadian women were allowed to do overseas was to be a nursing sister. They used to be nuns, but then they needed more and more, and all they needed was good nurses with good skills and compassion to come in and be there. She is, as a Canadian nursing sister, she wears a blue gown, which is where their nickname came from, the Bluebirds. And so this book is called Bluebird. So she is in one of the clearance center hospitals in Belgium. And that is when we meet a gentleman that comes in, and he is, I had never heard of this before either, he is from one of the 3 Canadian tunneling battalions. And so the tunnelers were the crazy men who dug 100 feet underground so that they could go underneath the trenches and blow them up. And sometimes they would be in combat underground with Germans who were tunneling. It's crazy. Nobody ever hears about this, but that's what they did. And I actually learned Peaky Blinders because Thomas Shelby was one of them. And so I've got the 2 of them meeting in the hospital, but then I have them go back to their homes, and they both happen to be from the Windsor, Ontario area. And they get caught up in the bootlegging and rum running time. That was the busiest bootlegging port anywhere in the world at that point, because Michigan had gone dry 2 years for every other state. So everybody there was coming across Michigan through Detroit over to Windsor to get the booze. So it was very active there. So that is, I wanted to talk about Prohibition, but then I went back to talk about World War I, and all along the way I had to talk about the Spanish flu. That was a requirement for writing in 2020. So yeah, it's a fun book. Every one of the books has a different mood to it, and I had fun with this book.
You can't give us a sneak peek at the 2023 book?
I can tell you that it's taking place during World War II. Not all of my books are going to take place during wars. I think the one after that is not going to be. But I don't want to get into too much.
Okay. We'll wait. Maybe we'll talk again next year.
3 different brands of fighting in. Yes, I'll be happy to tell you all about it next year. Okay. I'm not done it anyway. I'm sort of a third of the way through it anyway, so.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you to the St. Albert Library for putting on such a wonderful event as well. I don't know, Michelle, if there are any questions from the audience. I know Jen has another event that she has to go to in a few minutes, so I'll leave it there.
We just have a couple questions and a couple comments, and then we can let you go on your very busy way. So Donna's question is Genevieve aware of Ann Wheeler's story for, it's not actually for Bye Bye Blues, it's a war story when her father was interned in a Japanese POW camp? It would make for an interesting conversation.
So I do not have plans to write about the Japanese internment, but I can tell you, I mean, I may eventually, but I can tell you that in the 2023, I am writing about the German Canadian internments, because we don't know about those. And the Ukrainian internments, all these Canadian people, and the Japanese were the largest group, definitely, that were interned, but there were smaller groups of Canadians who were interned. And so I'm going to write a little bit about the German internment here.
Okay. So Barb is asking, you write about historical topics. Here it is 2021, and much of what you write about, hang on, let me just, war, humankind's cruelty to each other, anti-Semitism, anti-immigration, incredible cruelty to children, amongst others, are still, alas, present and happening around the world, and in some places seem to be escalating. How do you stay so upbeat when you do your research and write your books? Do you hope that your books can change people's views or opinions? That's a heavy one.
No, I don't think I hope that I change any opinions, but I hope that I am opening some eyes. Because again, I feel like when I wanted to learn about the residential school system, I wanted to write a book, but I am not going to, because that's not my position to write. And I look forward to the person who does write that book, but it's not mine. But when I wanted to write about it, I didn't want to write about it from the CBC point of view. You know, it's a very limited tunnel vision. And so with books like this, I find you can see it from different angles. Like with Come From Away, you can see what this poor German Nazi boy was going through in his mind, trying to figure out where he fit in. And so no, I don't want to change opinions, because I'm not even sure. I try not to have opinions on historical events, but I do want to open some eyes. I have opinion on when things are not taught. That makes me angry, but and history repeats. So I think that it's also important that we learn these things going forward. When I learn about the Spanish flu, we have to keep in mind that we are still here. We did survive, and we went on to turn into a huge population all over again. So we did survive. So learning history is important.
What is it about World War II era that keeps inspiring so many fiction writers?
I don't know. Everybody's writing World War II. It's crazy. But I guess it's because it's more recent. There are, as Elinor said, there are still veterans from that time that can tell you their memories. And it feels almost, and maybe it's because there's so many movies and shows about it too, that you feel like you could almost touch, where it was, where it happened, which is great. But I'm not getting tired of these World War II stories. I read them all the time because my friends are writing them, and sometimes they ask me to write little blurbs for them, which is great. But I'm not tired of them yet, because everyone somehow gets to write a different aspect of it and then include the fictional part of it. And that's what writing historical fiction is all about, is to keep us engaged in the history and the characters. So yes, World War II is popular. I don't know if it's going to fade or not, but it's enjoyable for me anyway.
I'm just going to point out, I don't know if everybody saw this in the chat, but Michelle said a friend of a friend wrote a graphic novel about the Christie Pitts incident, and she put a link in the chat for that. And Louise commented that following reading the last book, she found out we have the British Home Child Day on the 28th of September. So I was not aware of that either. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to end with one last question. What was the specific spark that made you want to write Letters Across the Sea?
The specific spark for that one was the Christie Riot, and wanting to write about the largest ethnic riot in Canada. I read Canadian history, I read largest, and I think, how can I not write about it? I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I started. I mean, I had a vague idea, but I wanted to know what this big event was and why I didn't know about it. So that's usually what gets me. It's like when I wrote about the British Home Children, I thought, how can I not? It's so important.
Yeah, it's great. I love this idea of putting the stories out there that we just never really learned about. It's important, and also, like I said, very interesting. You want to learn about these things. So
it is important.
Yeah. So,
wait, you wanted to know about the oboe.
oh yes. So what happened? Do you still
You
play
want to
the
know that.
oboe?
I do not still play. I went to University of Toronto to play the oboe, and I have a Bachelor of Music Performance in the oboe. My plan was to be principal oboe of the Montreal Symphony, but that did not come to pass. I ended up realizing that I was not going to make much money as a musician. Of course, then I turned into a writer, and there's no guarantee of money there either. But I went into all sorts of different things, advertising, promotions. I actually have an autoimmune disease, and I can't play the oboe anymore. I probably should have taken up cello years ago. But I was a piano player, and as well, not great, but good enough. And I did spend years teaching dozens of kids to play piano. So I did do good with my music. I may not have achieved my oboe potential, but I did something good with it. So
That's fantastic. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elinor. Thank you, Genevieve. You're both so busy. Elinor was telling me before we started that she pops in on book clubs. If people ask her to join their book clubs when they're reading her books, she'll go. Genevieve has something like in half an hour. Just keep going and going. So I'm going to just say a few thank yous. Again, thank you to you both. This is such a lovely way to spend an afternoon. Thank you, Louisa, for keeping track of the comments and the questions. I want to thank our funders, our main funders, the City of St. Albert, the Friends of the St. Albert Public Library, Alberta Foundation for the Arts, Canada Council for the Arts, and our media sponsors are the St. Albert Gazette, T8N Magazine, and Edify Magazine. And speaking of the Friends of the Library, I'm going to give a very quick plug. They have fundraiser Real Mondays movie night. The next one is on Monday at 7. And the movie is The Public, which is a fantastic movie about public libraries, fiction. And for everyone, you will be getting a survey at the end of the entire festival. We want to know what you think, what authors you want to see at Starfest in 2022, and your survey will enter you in a draw for a set of all the Starfest books, which will include Letters Across the Sea. Tomorrow afternoon, we have Amanda Leduc being in conversation with our writer-in-residence, Nisha Patel, talking about The Centaur's Wife. You can still get tickets for that at starfest.ca. So I'm going to say good afternoon, everyone. This was really lovely. Thank you so much.